Even though Spider-Man's still owned by Sony, the fact that he's now interacting with all the other Marvel characters, it means he finally came home. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and another installment in my Spider-Man review series, where I review every single Spider-Man movie in the lead up to my review of No Way Home. And today we're talking about the first MCU solo Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man Homecoming. So before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's jump right into it and let's talk about Spider-Man Homecoming. This stars Tom Holland as Peter Parker, who balances his life as an ordinary high school student in Queens with his superhero alter ego, Spider-Man, and he soon finds himself on the trail of a new menace prowling the skies of New York City. So before we begin, as I've been doing with all the other reviews in this series, this will get into spoiler territory. So if you haven't seen Spider-Man Homecoming by now and you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. Jon Watts takes over as director, and this is the first solo Spider-Man movie now set within the MCU. After the mixed reception and franchise low box office numbers for The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Sony scrapped all planned future installments of that series and instead cut a deal with Marvel where Spider-Man gets to appear in other MCU movies, while Marvel gets to co-produce his solo films also set within the MCU. Now, this isn't Spider-Man's first MCU appearance, as he previously appeared in Captain America Civil War, which we won't be covering for this series as he only has a small part in that film, but that did establish his presence within the MCU and gave us a good jumping off point to get right into the swing of things with the character here. No pun intended. And one thing worth noting for both Civil War and this film is that neither are origin stories for Spider-Man. Instead, it's established that Peter Parker is already working in his makeshift suit as Spider-Man, handling small crimes in New York, when he's discovered by Tony Stark, played as usual by Robert Downey Jr., and recruited to help out in Civil War. So for the first time, we get a brand new Spider-Man, and we don't spend his first few appearances rehashing what we already saw in both the Raimi films and the Amazing Spider-Man movies. Peter's already been bit by the spider, and Spider-Man is already in the process of becoming more of a superhero. And this is a bit of a different take on the character who, while an Avenger in the comics, was never really known for his deep ties to Iron Man, whose presence looms over the whole film here, with Robert Downey Jr. returning for a small supporting part, along with Jon Favreau as Happy Hogan, who becomes Peter's main point of contact. It's not exactly what everyone had in mind for the character, with a common criticism directed towards both this and Far From Home being that Spider-Man's tied too heavily to the Avengers and is too much in Tony Stark's shadow, rather than being able to mostly do his own thing. And I totally get that, especially since this is a character with so much great material to play around with, and is someone who's easily a lot more well known than any of the other Marvel characters, even with the popularity of the MCU now. But you also have to keep in mind, due to this now being the second reboot of this character in a live action film, you had to start out with doing something different. Because what would have happened if they chose to do something similar to the first Raimi film or the first Amazing Spider-Man, where we once again go through the spider bite and Uncle Ben's death, this would have just been called derivative. And I'd probably be saying the same thing, as that was one of my main criticisms of The Amazing Spider-Man, which I liked, but I felt it was too boxed in, having to go through the motions that were similar to a movie that we just got 10 years prior. This gets to do something considerably different while still making it clear who Spider-Man is and still honing in on the themes of power and responsibility. But it approaches those themes from a different angle, especially focusing on a period of Spider-Man's life that the other movies actually don't get to highlight quite as much, and that's his high school years. Unlike the other films where it shows either Peter briefly in high school or getting ready to leave high school and then jumping to life after the fact, this shows him as a sophomore and places a major emphasis on him being a kid, with these being his formative years. This isn't meant to be the same type of Spider-Man we're used to, where he becomes a much more confident but still flawed hero halfway through the movie. A lot of people even jokingly call call Holland Spider-Man Spider-Boy or Spider-Teen, or even Iron Man Jr. This is a much more reckless Peter Parker, who is eager to jump in and help where he can, but doesn't think everything through. He doesn't have all the solutions, and any answers he has might be counterproductive, even though he means well. We get to spend a considerable amount of time seeing him go through a lot more trial and error that a kid would probably go through. And that's not to say the previous iterations weren't flawed, because they most certainly were, but I'd argue they definitely matured a lot faster than this version did, and even though they still made mistakes, they were a lot more confident in their decision making after we got past their origins. So I like that this approached him from a different angle. I know the MCU has been criticized for feeling a bit too formulaic and clean cut with some of their movies, but I thought this was a refreshing take on the character, as it's something different, even though of course I do miss the Spider-Man we know and love. And Tom Holland just makes for a wonderful Spider-Man altogether. He's very funny, charismatic, he's got a great energy about him, and he has fantastic chemistry with literally just about everyone else around him. We get a lot of great laughs out of him annoying someone with his consistent talking or the endless amount of quips he makes, which is more than your usual MCU character. Now, going along with this different take on Spider-Man, we do see him with a different circle of friends. This time his best friend isn't Harry Osborn, nor is his love interest Mary Jane Watson. Instead, his best friend is Ned, played by a scene-stealing Jacob Batalon, and his love interest is Liz, played by Laura Harrier. Plus, you do have Flash Thompson, played by Tony Revolori, with this being the character's biggest role in any of the Spidey films, and you had Zendaya as Michelle, who we later find out is also called MJ, and who's also a bit suspicious of Peter, as well as a teenage version of Betty Brant, played by Andrea Rice. And with all these different dynamics in place, it gave this a teen romantic comedy spin on Spider-Man, which is something we never truly got to explore with the character. We've had him fawning over Mary Jane or Gwen Stacy in previous iterations with a cute little joke thrown in there, but this dives almost head first into the genre, balancing out its superhero elements with rom-com elements, and it gave this a much needed fresh feel, as it still provided a nice exploration of his character without it feeling exactly like it was just ripping off either the Tobey Maguire or Andrew Garfield films. And what's nice is, given the fact it spends so much time on this stage of Peter's life, rather than rushing him out of school and making him grow up so quickly all within the span of one movie, it allows us to really see him, as well as the rest of these characters, grow and be more in the moment with them, so they can process more what's happening to them and their surroundings. Not that that was necessarily a flaw of the other movies, as I obviously love the first two Raimi films and have enjoyed to a degree everything between those films and this. It's just nice to get a fresher perspective for the character, and considering it's looking like Holland's going to be sticking around for a while and he's a bit closer to the character's actual age in these films, it's going to be incredible seeing how far he comes along in so many future adventures over the course of all these years. But what makes this film even all the more interesting is, of course, yet another great Spidey villain, and that's Michael Keaton as Adrian Toomes, also known as the Vulture. Not only is he one of the best Spider-Man villains portrayed on film, but he's also easily one of the best MCU villains, overcoming a problem that the MCU has been criticized for, where they don't exactly have as compelling of villains to go along with their heroes. But this once again plays nicely into what makes all of Spider-Man's villains so intriguing, while also not taking a page directly out of the playbook of all the villains seen in either the Maguire or Garfield films. Here, Toomes is just a guy who's looking to provide for his family. He leads a waste management team who's removed off the job of cleaning up the city after the attack in the Avengers, and now he's in a spot where he feels wronged and feels he's within his rights to take extreme measures, which is where he keeps the alien tech from the attack. But he's never someone who's out to make others suffer or take over the world. While he'll make sure no one gets in his way and we don't agree with the things that he does here, you can kind of understand where he's coming from, especially as he just wants to make sure his family is looked after. And that made him all the more fascinating, especially with Michael Keaton just giving an excellent performance as per usual. And it was also cool getting to see Bokeem Woodbine pop up as one of Toomes' men, Herman Schultz, who becomes another popular Spider-Man villain, Shocker. Plus, all this gives way to one of the most brilliant twists in the movie, which is that Toomes is also the father of Peter's love interest Liz, and I thought that was handled so well. The two storylines were both very prominent. However, they were kept so separate without any winking or obvious lines thrown in there that might hint at it. So when it's revealed halfway through the film, it catches us completely off guard, and it adds such a nice personal connection to this storyline with Toomes, who I already found fascinating even without this twist. Plus, it gives us what's easily one of the most well-done sequences in the entire MCU, where Toomes drives Peter and Liz to the prom, and as he engages them in conversation, he starts piecing together himself that Peter's Spider-Man. The way it's shot, with a lot of tight close-ups, along with Michael Keaton Keaton's excellent facial expressions convey this extreme sense of claustrophobia that makes this moment nerve-wracking, especially when it's followed by the scene of Toombs threatening Peter prior to going into the dance. Easily one of the finest instances of tension building within the entire MCU, and it really allows Jon Watts to shine as a director here. And I would say any moment of personal tension is where this film really thrives, such as that scene or the one where Peter gets chastised by Stark after a fight on the Staten Island ferry. And when we get to see some of that conveyed in the action scenes, those were some of the best moments within the film. Like when Peter as Spider-Man rescues his friends in Washington DC, having to climb on top of the Washington Monument. Even though Peter has the ability to climb such tall buildings, this also shows us he's not going to suddenly be comfortable with it just because he now can. And once again, it goes back to that relatability factor. He's someone with fears that we can all relate to, and it adds an extra layer of emotion to that scene. Now, with Iron Man having a heavy influence over this film, with Peter being his protege and a lot of Stark and alien technology being used, it does lead to some really cool moments, especially with Peter at one point bonding with the voice of his new suit. And it allows for a few different angles to be taken with Spider-Man fights, with them getting to be a bit bigger and more grandiose than normal because of all that technology. Now, with some of the digital effects, some of it can look a bit too obvious. I know with a lot of the moves and weapons relying on tech, there's only so much they can do in terms of practical effects, but it did feel like there were just like a couple of brief sequences where it's a little too reliant on digital and it's noticeable. So I didn't always quite feel the intensity of a few scenes, mainly towards the end. But it's really a nitpick because for the most part, these action scenes are incredibly solid, making this, in the end, very entertaining. Spider-Man Homecoming might be yet another reboot for the character, but it takes him in some exciting new directions while still staying true to the character, changing up the dynamics among Peter's friends, as well as now being able to incorporate elements of the larger MCU, is a breath of fresh air, allowing for a lot of laugh-out-loud humor, as well as some really slick action scenes. Tom Holland shows us he's a very charismatic Spider-Man, though the film also shines due to Michael Keaton as the Vulture, giving us not only one of the best Spider-Man villains, but one of the best MCU villains. This is one of the finest MCU films, one of the finest Spider-Man films, and is an easy must-watch. Spider-Man Homecoming gets a 9.5 out of 10. Very well made film, and actually one of my favorites in the MCU as a whole. There are only so many other MCU films that I would rate that high, to be quite honest. It's a bit of a different take on the character than what we're used to, but they really made it into something its own, and made it all the more enjoyable for it. So next up, we'll be pausing on the MCU for a moment, and I already discussed Venom in a previous review, which I know isn't a Spider-Man centered movie, but is in what's now called Sony's Spider-Man universe, so it technically would have counted for this review series if I hadn't done it yet, but we'll be jumping ahead to another of one of the most beloved Spider-Man films, Into the Spider-Verse. And in the meantime, let me know, did you see Spider-Man Homecoming, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Is this one of your favorite Spider-Man movies? Is Tom Holland your favorite Spider-Man? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.